What's your biggest shock family discovery? Story one. I'll give you two. One is true, one is assumed. The first one, my mom had an affair during the marriage and got pregnant. My dad was aware and obvious not okay with it, but they both decided not to tell me or my siblings about it. Funny thing, and I will likely never know the full details as to how, but the child was adopted by another two people, and we would routinely visit what we thought was our friend, but was actually our half-sister. I only found out about what I know because my father had an outburst and accidentally slipped one tiny detail. The remaining info I coaxed out of my mom over the years. I cannot verify and refuse to ask, but I don't know if the adoption was done legally or not. You'll know why I mentioned that later. The second one, my mom and dad split shortly after the affair, maybe 2 to 3 years later. Me and most of my siblings ended up with my dad. He would make constant jokes about eliminate drifters. Like, probably 4 or 5 times a year would make a joke about eliminate specifically drifters. Didn't think much of it until about 6 to 8 years ago. I was talking to my mom and said something about doing an ancestry DNA test to learn more about my heritage. My mother immediately lost all glow in her face and told me to never submit my DNA to that place or any other, and that was that. I've thought about it so much over my life. What if my mom and dad eliminate people in the past and got away with it? What if my mom isn't my mom? Story 2. In 2018, through Ancestry DNA, we found out that my great-grandfather's brother had a daughter no one else knew about. The daughter was now in her 90s. We were able to meet her and had a mini reunion for her to meet the 4 living half-siblings she had. Apparently, great-grandfather's brother, who was like 19 ton at the time, got 2 teen girls pregnant. One did not want to marry him because he was a tipsy gambler, etc. So he married the other girl, and they went on to have 8 kids. They never had anything to do with the daughter, except he did stop by once when she was like 6 years old. No one in the family knew. All of that generation were dead, but my mom knows that her grandfather would not be okay with his brother discarding a child like that. Great-grandfather also had a sister. This woman, the secret daughter, looked a lot like her. Story 3. Throwaway just to respond to this and ensure my family doesn't see it. I am 50 and my mom, still alive, is 80. I submitted my DNA to Ancestry DNA like 15 years ago just because I thought it would be interesting, and we have no privacy these days anyway, so I wasn't worried about my DNA being out there. Fast forward to this year, and long story short, I found out that the person I call dad is not actually my biological father. I confronted my mom, and when she heard the name of my name match, she confirmed it was true, an affair from 50 years ago. My dad is still alive and doesn't know. My biological father is dead. She clearly hoped to take this to her grave. As of right now, my mom thinks that only she and I know. My son and his wife also know. I haven't been able to go to a family gathering since I found out because I'm just still processing it all. Story 4. My cousin tried to take down her father with her boyfriend when she was young. He was black, she's white, and mom and dad did not approve. I don't remember the details, but she gave the boyfriend a map of the house and they planned it. Dad woke up when the boyfriend was in the bedroom before he could do anything. Everyone survived. Now she's MAGA and wicked racist. So I like to bring that story up at every family gathering. Story 5. My mother's family is one of those appearances are everything looks nice on the outside, rotten to the core on the inside. My mother, a raging narcissist, disliked her sister openly and cruelly. And my aunt is no perfect victim. The woman is on who knows how many substances and seems to exist in the belief that she's the star of a movie and everyone else is in the background. It turns out my aunt had a secret baby. In the 70s, my aunt had a baby out of wedlock. She was a late teenager and went to a girl's home to have the baby, gave it up for adoption, and the entire family was sworn to the strictest secrecy about it. 40 years later, her daughter had finally decided to reach out to get to know her bio family, and my aunt decided to act like everything was super normal about this and bring her to Christmas, unannounced. None of us besides my aunts and mother had any idea. Just, this woman is your cousin. Surprise! We were all fully expected to treat her like we all knew her all along, and this was not shocking or surprising at all. My aunt was incredibly unstable about the whole thing and tried to insert herself in her long-lost daughter's life as if she'd always been there, doing things like showing up unannounced and demanding to be at kids' parties, etc. Trying to pretend Grammy had been there the whole time and had as much right to be there as her adoptive family who actually raised her. She'd always had major issues with boundaries. My poor surprise cousin dipped and went no contact in less than 6 months. It was a complete shoot show, and I feel awful for everyone involved. I realize this is probably at least part of why my aunt's so messed up. Trauma, forced adoption, being forced to pretend it never happened, and severe emotional abuse are a hell of a substances. As to why my mother disliked her so much, my mom is just really fudge mean. Probably never forgave her for embarrassing her by having a whole jerk baby. Story 6. My favorite uncle growing up married my dad's sister. They were dink wasp and the kind of people to have wine with every dinner. I never saw my uncle not wearing a collared shirt, and the most activity I ever saw him do was play golf. He was a hoot and jovial and solidly upper middle class. I have known this man literally my entire life. I was in my late 20s, married for several years. We were in town and went out to dinner with the family. During dinner conversation, he casually mentioned he has a silver star. I didn't even know he was in the military. Apparently, he was Air Force Spec Ops during Vietnam and got a silver star for actions in Cambodia. I said, I didn't know we were at war with Cambodia during Vietnam. Oh, we weren't. I was assisting the CIA special group that had gotten trapped at an installation. Anyways, rest in peace, Uncle Jimmy. A man with a terrible chip shot and the ability to eliminate people with a pencil. Story 7. A family friend who was always over was a child molester. Like lots of people knew, and so they just kept him away from kids. Fudge boomers. I have never forgiven a lot of people for that, and then just kind of being like, yeah, but it was different in the 60s and 70s. Answer, oh my God. My dad's best friend was a chomo, and I went through some pretty intense therapy last year to process the fact that my parents kept him so close to our family. He was basically there from the start and at my family's house often. I asked my mom why they didn't have stronger boundaries against him, and she said that no one would have believed them if they spoke up. Thanks for not protecting us, I guess. Story 8. I didn't find out until my mid-30s that my dad's mom shot and eliminated her first husband with his own service revolver when she walked in on him trying to smother their baby for crying too much. This happened while they were living on base. She was fully acquitted as it was ruled a justifiable homicide. Her second husband drowned under some vaguely mysterious circumstances. She went on to raise all 7 kids on her own. My grandmother and my dad used to hunt black bears to help feed everyone. She once told me when I was 9 or 10, and she was teaching me to play poker, that back in the day, I'd have been shot dead for dealing that poorly. Granny did not fudge around. Answer. My great-grandfather eliminated 4 people, including his estranged wife, before setting his home on fire and shooting himself. My grandfather was 7, and he and his brothers became orphaned overnight. This was not ever discussed in my family until I was nearly 18. My family still owns and lives on the land. We used to sit in the remaining foundation and build fires to roast weenies and marshmallows when I was a child. This was an activity I begged to do frequently for many years of my childhood. Story 9. The first shock was when I was 12 and found out my twin brother was in fact my half-twin brother. We have different fathers. My mom has superfetation. The second shock was recently when I found out, at almost 40 I did not have cancer as a child. CSA HPV that turned into cervical cancer. Instead, I found out I had had an abortion at 9 My mother never told me, and I don't have many good memories growing up. I was told my whole life I had had cancer. Shocked absolutely does not cover that revelation. Story 10. Discovered that the reason I was adopted by my grandmother was so that my grandmother had some kind of leverage against my biological mother. They were both abusive as fudge, though, and my grandmother attempted to eliminate me later. So nobody was really the victim in that situation, and I've got no sympathy for either of them. Story 11. When my grandmother died and I was 16, my mom realized when doing paperwork that they married before she was born and figured out it must have been forced. We all move on. And a couple years later, her husband remarried. My mom had always been told that this was her dad. The woman he married was terrible and ran everyone off. One of my uncles said to my mom, well, he's probably not your real dad anyway. And we're like, hold up a minute, what? Turns out my grandma had been seeing 2 guys, apparently, and knew it was the other guy's baby. She married the one she thought had better prospects because my bio-granddad had been arrested for some dumb teen stuff. It took us 2 more years to track him down. My mom finally met her biological father when she was 40 years old. Unfortunately, we only got a few years with him before he passed away suddenly from an aneurysm. It's been over 15 years and I still miss him, though. He was so happy to finally meet us. The wildest thing to me, though, is that we all carry a very rare genetic disorder. My mom, my sister, me, and my grandpa. He was where it came from, not a random mutation. Even before we got the DNA test back, we were pretty sure because of that fact. Story 12. Not long before he was lost to dementia, my father started writing his autobiography, First shock was that his English was so poor, I thought he was better educated. Turns out his mother was a woman who somehow made a living from the sailors in a naval town. His paternity was never clear to him. He remembered sleeping in a bed with 3 siblings. His mother had another baby which was added to the sleeping arrangement. One morning he woke up and the baby was dead next to him. His grandmother and her husband ran a naval tailor shop in another naval town, and one day she intervened. That changed his whole future. He went to live above the shop and was sent to the local school. He did well, enough to go to the grammar school in the next town, commuting by train. When he matriculated, he got an apprenticeship with a local company who had a shipyard and several coastal steamers. When WW2 broke out, he was still an apprentice. In the naval harbor, there was an anti-aircraft ship, an old merchant ship stuffed with AA guns, moored to protect the dockyard from Stukas. The guns were fired automatically to create a box barrage over the dockyard. One day, the Stukas came for that ship and sunk it. The water was full of floating bodies, and my father was sent out with the launches to recover them. He was 19. He finished his apprenticeship and started his career as a ship's engineer, mostly in tankers. He was sunk 3 times. Most of the war he spent crossing the Atlantic. He told of the times he spent in New York waiting for a ship to be repaired. Young, handsome man in a uniform, he said never had to pay for anything and had the time of his life. You can imagine. I got no details, just a grin. It was in this period he reckons he broke the world record for climbing an engine room ladder every time there was a bang. He saw terrible sights when other tankers were hit. After the war, he still had an exciting life. He was a top engineer for diesel-powered ships working for Shell. He would be flown first class around the world to fix problems. Once he was offered a job in Australia, but my mother didn't want to leave her family. I was nearly an Australian. He was very proud of his ear service, although as a merchant seaman, no recognition. There is a book on Amazon, British Merchant Losses in WW2 are something. It lists the ships sunk and gives a brief story about what happened to each crew. Heartbreaking stuff. When a ship was sunk, the owner stopped paying the crew immediately. After a sinking, the surviving crew was sent on another ship. No choice. They were not even allowed to join the armed forces, which would have been safer. My dad was a quiet, unassuming man with some amazing skills in the workshop. He could take scrap and make something useful. He made a fully functional lathe out of a bedstead and a washing machine. As he said, when you are on a ship 1,000 miles from help and it stops working, someone has to improvise. Story 13. Pretty tame considering, I guess, but I discovered via the internet that my great-great-grandfather was not only the most notorious moonshiner in his county, but he also did time in prison for horse stealing from his brother. I suppose Thanksgiving was likely a tense time, at least till they brought out the moonshine. Story 14. My family lies about causes of passing, and it's fudge stupid because I went decades not knowing about our family history of tragic end mental illness. Car accident, actually a tragic end. Cancer, actually AIDS tipsy and fell off a bridge. Actually a tragic end. Natural causes, actually a tragic end. Liver cancer, actually late-stage alcoholism. Story 15. I grew up in a very conservative, pro-life, no intimacy before marriage, etc., family. I found out as an adult that 2 women in my family got abortions at a young age, both before married. Both are still pro-life today. Over the years, I've read several articles about how conservative women justify their own abortion while condemning others. But it was shocking to see this in action. Answer: about 8 years ago, my dad and I were venting on the phone to each other about my stepbro and his then wife being intense anti-choice. And my dad says to not say anything anti-choice, anti-abortion in front of my aunt, his sister, as she's had one. I was shocked because said aunt is loudly, proudly pro-choice, as am I. So why did my dad have to clarify this to me? Story 16. My grandmother's family was heavily involved with the Irish mob in Boston. Her father and uncles were all low-level enforcer types. I found this out after she passed. We were laughing about how she always insisted on sitting facing the door at any restaurant at which we were dining, and my grandfather said she learned that from her dad, so you can see somebody coming in if they're trying to eliminate you. He told us a bunch more stories after that, including about how his father-in-law's superiors were heavily involved in garbage collection-related extortion. Story 17. That my cousin had shot to eliminate his 6-year-old son to keep him out of the hands of his ex-mother-in-law and then shot himself. They found him when the tragic end note he wrote mailed showed up at his brother's place. He was a shy guy and worked as a social worker. His mother-in-law was wealthy, hired lawyers to yank his son from him, and even though his ex-wife never wanted the kid, even when they were married. Story 18. My great-uncle shot his dad, my great-grandfather, with a shotgun when he was 12. I learned about this looking in newspaper archives for information about when my dad played sports in H's college. The newspaper article included a quote from a neighbor. Wait for it. We always knew there was something not right about that family. Story 19. My brother was chemically castrated 2 months ago for an intimacy offense, legal where he is, and his only option to avoid his prison term being indefinitely extended. He's been super depressed and trying to find DIY ways to overcome the effects of the substances, but he says none of them work. Story 20. I'm shocked by how my family is completely okay and embrace a family member that committed SA against his ex-wife. He spent 8 years in prison for raping her while she was passed out tipsy and uploaded it to an adult content site. Yet I'm weird and flaky because I refuse to attend family gatherings when he's present. I'm still gobsmacked years later. Answer: sounds like my father's family. That rat bastard violation a minor as a grown jerk man, and my grandmother bulldozed everyone else to allow him to continue to participate in family life once he was out of prison. Luckily, I've been estranged from them since childhood. Because Jesus tap dancing Christ, I would not have been able to keep the peace. I won't lie. I'm a mostly confident, self-assured person, and there are still days where I feel terrible that they chose a literal child rapist over me who has never done an evil like that in my life. Oof. Story 21. My adopted family? Apparently there was an aunt in the early 20th century that performed a kitchen table abortion on her son's GF, not married, but basically my aunt, had they been married, she hung herself not long after that. Poor woman edit, early 20th century. The town 1918 to 1923. Story 22. My grandfather rode motorcycles. I never knew this growing up. He never talked about it, and I'd never seen one at his place. 2 years ago, we went to visit him for Christmas. He took me and my husband out to the car barn. I knew he'd restored 57 Chevys, so I figured he wanted to show off his current project. He took us to a side room and pulled a sheet of an intact 59 Cushman Eagle. It was rusty, sure, but all the parts were there. Then he pointed to another sheet, and we pulled it off. There was a Frankenbike with a lawnmower engine, and then he pulled out a picture of him riding it. Turns out he'd been pretty wild in his youth, and my grandma never let him ride again. But he kept a few projects in the barn so that one day he could. He passed away on Christmas Eve last year. That Cushman Eagle is now sitting in my garage so I can get it running again. Story 23. I was at my grandma's funeral, and in the program it went through the family that passed away before her, and it mentioned a life that hadn't been born. I asked my sister who had a miscarriage, and she said, oh, our mom, between me and the second youngest brother. I'm the youngest. She was 8 months pregnant. Everyone in my family knew except me. Even my brother, who is 3 years older than me, knew. I found out at a funeral that I was a rainbow baby. Story 24. My grandparents on my mom's side had 8 children. Growing up, my mom kept us under the impression that my grandpa was a great man. When I was in high school, he passed away from cancer. It was really tough on the whole family. But my grandmother started seeing a rich guy 30 years her junior, while my grandpa was dying of cancer. She also had a bunch of plastic surgery and was very separated from the whole family emotionally. Almost 15 years later, my mom and aunts get a letter from her. She laid out the truth about their relationship. He impregnated her while she was underage. 16, I think. And in her words, kept her pregnant for 8 years after that. He basically assaulted her for years and abused her, and no one knew. When he got sick, she finally felt brave enough to leave. Story 25. That a cousin, a year older than my dad, was really my father's brother. My grandmother gave him to her sister to raise, as she already had 2 kids and no money from my grandfather. The guy was a clone to my dad, and it was so obvious to everyone. The fudge up part is after giving him away, my grandmother went on to have 2 more kids. Story 26. My mom was molested as a child, and my grandmother helped cover it up because the abuser was a family member and she didn't want to tarnish the family name. We only learned about this after my mom committed tragic end, and my dad began reading her diary for clues. She blocked the abuser out of her life for years, but he called her one day and it flipped a switch. Story 27. When I was 12, I found paperwork stashed away in the basement that showed both my older sister and I had different fathers than the one that was currently raising us. When I got the nerve up to ask my very conservative acting mom, she told me that my sister was from a brief fling when she was 18, and I was from a previous marriage from a man who died in Vietnam. My birth father was married before, and I also had 3 half-siblings from that. It explained a lot of why my younger brothers were treated so much better than we were, and they wondered why I went off the rails as a teenager. Story 28. Growing up, I was super close with my cousin. We were best friends, and I would take care of her due to some physical medical conditions she was born with. I was about 10 when I found out she was actually my sister, who was adopted by my aunt, because Child Protective Services took her away from my parents, thinking the medical condition, which left a lot of bruises, was child abuse. They fought in court to the point of bankruptcy and even made front-page news once, as well as one of those Jerry Springer-esque shows in the 80s. We are still super close was just a weird shock. Story 29. That my mom cheated on my dad for the better part of 20 years. I knew because as a young child, I witnessed it a couple of times because the man would be at our house pretty often and him and my mom would certainly not hide it. This man would be at my house every day while my father was at work and sometimes when my father was there. My dad is a naive guy, so I think that to him, it was just a friend of him and my mother coming over for coffee. Anyway, I would ask my mother throughout my teenage years if what I saw was reality or not. And she would always swear that it wasn't the case and basically gaslit me into thinking I didn't see what I saw. I confronted my mother when I was 24 years old and told her that I want the truth once and for all, and I would not back down, and she broke down and admitted it. And the first words out of her mouth while crying were, "Don't tell your father." I was in true shock for the first time in my life, even though deep down I already knew. Now, a few years have passed, and I still have not told my father because I'm torn between being a good son and telling him the truth or completely crushing him for however many years that he has left. I bear the weight of this burden every day, and I'm so full of guilt because of it. TLDR, Mom cheated on my dad for 20-some odd years, and I know, but my dad doesn't. Answer, honestly, he probably already knows as well and is intentionally ignoring it. I've now seen two scenarios when someone was told their partner was cheating, and while it may not have been directly verified, they absolutely already knew it was happening. Tell if you need to take the guilt, but there's nothing for you to feel guilty about. And you might be surprised by what he says if you do tell him. Story 30. As an adult, I found out my aunt and uncle or uncle and niece, as in my aunt is the oldest child of my grandma, my uncle, my grandma's youngest sibling. I am Chinese. There is a specific title for each relative, but that uncle, we literally say uncle in English. They never had kids, always treated my sister and I very well. I didn't see him much as a teen and adult. I'm not particularly close to any of my family, no dislike, just keep them at arm's length for various reasons. He recently passed from Parkinson's and dementia. He was in his 70s. My parents and aunt didn't want me to see him sick. I guess they wanted to shield me and keep his privacy dignity. We randomly went to my aunt and uncle's house to drop off eggs during the whole Costco ran out of eggs crisis. I guess everyone was in a good mood because I was able to say hi to my uncle. He remembered me and was super happy. He passed a week later. My aunt said she was very surprised he remembered me and that seeing me was the most lucid he was in a while. I think it gave him peace to let go. Story 31. 23andMe. I had taken it, and nothing weird came back at first. Then about a year later, I get a message from a girl around my age wondering how we're related. I'm shocked. It says she's my first cousin. My dad was an only child, and my mom has one brother, so of course it's fudge Uncle Randy. She looks exactly like him. Like there's no denying that's his daughter. I traced the timing back, and he was engaged to my aunt when she was conceived. Him and my aunt have been married for 30 years at this point with 2 other adult children. I send her some pics and give her his contact information, but she doesn't want to reach out. So now I'm friends with her on social media. Never met in person, just peering in on each other's lives. She seems really cool, and I'd love to meet her in real life, but it just seems awkward. To my knowledge, she's never reached out. I see my uncle like once a year, and it's so weird to know this and not say anything, but I also feel that it's none of my business. If she wants to reach out to him, then she can. Story 32. When I was researching ADHD symptoms and realized all of the quirky traits in my family were actually ADHD symptoms, I am fairly confident in saying that most of my extended family, nan, aunts, uncles, cousins, have it, but are undiagnosed and high masking. None of them want to know and don't believe me. Story 33. My ML was showing us a group photo of her family from when she was a child. She was like, "That's me with my mom and dad. Here's Uncle Bill. There's my cousin Rose. That's Kara," pointing at a teenager. I stopped her. "Kara, your stepmother?" "Yup, that's her. And here's my grandmama and papa." "But wait, why is your stepmother in this picture with you and your parents? Weren't they still married at this point? And she looks so young." "Oh, well, she was Uncle Bill and Aunt Marcia's ward at that point. After her own parents died, they took her in. Anyway, here's I had to stop her repeatedly to clarify as she just kept trying to bulldoze right past the fact that her stepmother had basically been her father's adoptive niece, and he had watched her grow up from the age of 7. The piping hot tea was that her mother disliked Kara because apparently teenage Kara had a crush on her father and would come over to the house to do his laundry, no one else's, just his, and her mother blamed Kara for their eventual divorce, after which her father married Kara when he was 48 and she was 21. My husband was shocked to learn all of this. Story 34. People have only one. My aunt got pregnant as a teenager in the 60s. She got sent away to finish her pregnancy and forced to give the kid up for adoption. Never heard anything about him after that. The kid tracked her down about 5 years ago through DNA. He's an awesome dude, and we're glad to have him in our family now, too. Found out just last year that when my grandparents got married in 1948, Grandma was pregnant with another man's child. Grandpa knew and married her anyway. We found out because my cousin had his DNA done and saw he shared 50 less DNA with his grandparents than he should have. Moral of the story, don't get your DNA done unless you're open to learning some crazy things. Story 35. That breast cancer runs in my dad's family. See, my grandmother was one of 6, 5 girls and a boy. My dad has a lot of first cousins. I think there's 24 of them all in. About 15 years ago, one of them developed breast cancer and went off to the oncologist, surgeon her doc recommend, a guy who's been doing this for like 40 years. She's got a pretty distinctive name, and while he was doing the exam, the doctor said, "I know this is strange, but you wouldn't happen to be her mother's name's daughter, would you?" And my dad's cousin said, "Yes, how did you know my mother?" And the doc said, "She was my very first solo mastectomy, and she kept talking about her kids. She was very proud of you and your brother." Apparently, my cousin sat up and said, "What are you talking about? My mother didn't have breast cancer." And the doc said, "Wasn't your mother name?" I did her surgery, and then a year later, I did her sister, my great-aunt's surgery when she was diagnosed. Which is how we found out that at least 2 of the sisters had breast cancer and literally never told anyone except possibly their husbands. Not their daughters, not their nieces, nobody. And that's how all 14 of my father's female first cousins and all of their daughters ended up having gene testing. And it's how we found out that literally of 27 women across 2 generations, only my first cousin and I don't carry the BRCA and B mutations. That was fun. Story 36. Mine was that my uncle kidnapped my cousin when he was a baby from his mother, who he divorced little after my cousin was born, took him across the border where an airplane was waiting with my grandmother. After they took off, my grandmother raised my cousin for a year hiding out in the mountains in Durango, Mexico. Then after they returned to my grandmother's hometown in Mexico, she raised him as her son. This was in the early 70s, where there were no cell phones or Amber Alerts. And the reason my uncle went to that extreme was that she took him across the border to the U.S. and her new SO at the time introduced her to substances. My dad used to travel across the border most of the time for his job, and he said he would get stopped every time asking about my uncle. My dad and uncle never had the best relationship, so when he told them every time he didn't know and didn't care, he meant it. He also helped raise my cousin and helped pay for his education. Story 37. My dad died when I was 21-ish in 2012. On his passing bed, he let me and my sister know we have a half-sister. My mom had known the start. I was rightfully pretty upset that I wasn't told prior, but the half-sister came about from a woman who basically hole in the condom in my dad to get my dad's genetics. He was a handsome and successful guy. I am sure she didn't know about the anxiety and addiction issues, LOL. Then left, leaving my dad pretty distraught, hence him holding it back from us. Story 38. I have a cousin whose grandmother was a dissident in Chile under the Pinochet regime and was imprisoned for a little over a year and unfortunately committed tragic end within a year of her release. Apparently, the torture was horrible, and she was a personal victim of Ingrid Olderock, the lady of the dogs, who led the regime's secret canine discipline team. Story 39. My great-3 ex-grandfather was a Union soldier who temporarily served as a prison guard at Camp Chase in Ohio, and this story I discovered from his diary journals passed down to me was crazy to me. At least at his time, the officers tried to distinguish between the low-level conscripts and the higher-ranking officers who were more likely to truly believe in the Confederate cause. Life was tough for the conscripts as the camp got bigger, but they weren't given any additional punishment. Some were even allowed to enjoy recreation like playing baseball. For the higher-ranking officers who were captured, though, who were found to have willfully rebelled, the Union officers sentenced them to some pretty gnarly punishments. The aftermath of the war was uncertain, and there was strong sentiment that traitors had to be punished now. So the Union officers set up 5-man tribunals to hear cases and sentence traitors to punishment. My ancestor served on some such tribunals. The one that really stood out in his mind was this, given how much he wrote about it. There was a cattle barn on site, I guess to provide food milk for the officers, or maybe even the prisoners, with maybe a few dozen cattle. Confederate captive officers would be led to the barn in cuffs, forced to climb up onto a cow facing backwards, and lie down, face hanging off the end, until his face was level with the animal's butt. The Union guards would press his face into the cow's butt and bind him tightly in that position, and leave him there to serve his punishment. 8 hours a day for 3 days was a common sentence, and apparently it was feared more than any other. Story 40. My grandmother was actually my great-aunt, and of course, one of my great-aunts was actually my grandmother. My non-biological grandmother was married, but they were unable to have children. So in WW2, when my grandfather was overseas, she adopted her born-out-of-wedlock sister's child with special permission from the Army. My dad found out in his early 20s there was a family fallout, etc. What we found out recently when I did DNA in a final effort to find out who my dad's father is, not knowing caused him huge distress through his life. Because his birth mother would never tell, I discovered we are related to my grandma's husband that adopted dad. So the two options are my grandma's husband, the 31, slept with her 18-year-old sister, or her 18-year-old sister slept with her husband's little brother, who would have been maybe 13 years old. We still can't work out which is worse. Story 41. When I was in my 20s, my great-grandmother lived with me for a few years when I first bought my home. One day I was leaving for work, and my aunt pulled into my drive as I was leaving. I stopped to say hello, passing she just wanted to visit Grandma, and she told me Uncle Jimmy died. I asked her, who the hell is Uncle Jimmy, LOL? Turns out he was my great-grandma's youngest son, who had been in jail since I was too young to remember him. Most of us great-grandkids never knew about him until he died in jail in 2005, having been in jail since 1985. Story 42. I'm adopted, and when I met my biological relatives in my 30s, found out I had 3 full-blood siblings close in age and 8 half-siblings. And the dad was a tipsy, violent guy who tried to eliminate an ex-girlfriend by burning her house down. Thankfully, he was long dead when I made contact. It's wild to think that there's someone so close to you in blood who was so unhinged. Like, am I capable of that too? I'm pretty boring in comparison. Story 43. Not mine, but my wife's shock. She lost her birth certificate and made a call to another U.S. state to get another. The woman on the other end said, no problem. Just tell me your parents' names on this certificate I'm holding now. Wife said her mother's name. Check. She said her father's name. Wrong. Her mother had gotten a divorce and kidnapped her, running off to another state halfway across the country, completely hidden from her paternal extended family. She spent 34 of her life believing the guy currently married to her mother was her father. Her mother had doctored up the birth certificate. She has since met her real father's family and has developed a relationship with them. Answer. My second cousin grew up with my dad, but old enough to have been his babysitter, found out that she was kidnapped as a baby in the 50s by the mob hitman. That was my great uncle because my aunt grandfather's sister wanted a baby, and he didn't want to risk the complications of pregnancy because his own mother died in childbirth. He died back in the 80s when a lot of mob guys were disappearing and dying. Shot in the back, no arrests ever made. My aunt told her daughter the truth on her deathbed in the 90s. Said he came home one day with a baby and a new car. No questions allowed. The cousin was able to find her real family using the information and old newspapers and a private investigator. She's still somehow family. She was loved very much. So it wasn't a bad life, but it is so messed up to steal her from her real family, no matter how good you think you would be, and I don't know how she mentally reconciled it. Story 44. My grandmother died right at the end of spring semester, my junior year of college. My girlfriend at the time was kind enough to go with me, and I very much appreciated her company. The funeral home is located in an old home near the center of town that was once owned by James K. Polk's family. In this super old house, there were 3 viewing galleries on the ground floor, the flower room, and a break room with drink machines and whatnot. The walls of the whole place are covered with memorabilia from the town's history. Old composites from schools long gone, notable visitors, newspaper clippings, all sorts of stuff. As we were walking through the funeral home, I'm pointing to people I know and telling stories about this place that I love so dearly. Then we take a turn into the break room. The break room has 4 tables with a few chairs around them. The far corner has a closet and the vending machines. Another corner has a coffee machine and assorted stuff like that. This leaves one corner that collected various junk like a coat rack and a mop bucket. The room was sort of full, so we made our way back toward the junk corner. And when we got there, the first frame photo I saw in a frame on the wall was of a man in full Klan regalia, sitting on horseback in the middle of a public street. Suddenly, I looked around and realized there were several picture frames with multiple Klansmen photos, and I sort of shoot myself. My uncle happened to see us talking and asked what was wrong. While I described the guy in red on horseback, he cut me off and said, "That's your grandfather," and just walked off chuckling. Some additional details about my grandfather. He claimed that he and his buddies threw every vote in a precinct for George Wallace in 1968. He and 2 friends owned a house that they leased out to a single mom, and the 3 of them took turns playing house. His obituary mentions a daughter that I've never met. I just assume that's the connection. I remember that when my grandmother told her kids what she had done, well, what he had done, there was a big fight. Anyway, the old bastard was beaten to passing with a tire iron for the 27 he had just won in a card game. Story 45. My grandfather ran away from home due to his abusive stepfather. That man would actively violation him and his younger brother. My great-grandma knew and sent his sisters away. It turned out that she met this man as he was a client of hers. It explained why my grandfather disliked his mother. Story 46. I found out I had 16 half-siblings after taking a 23andMe test a few years ago. Parents had to use a donor due to fertility issues and kept it a secret for 30 years. Surprisingly, turned out to be a good thing, though. Meeting the half-siblings has been fun and interesting. Lots of eerie similarities among us. Story 47. When our dad passed away, we found out there was a rumor that our mother slept with our uncle, Dad's brother, after I was born, but before my brother was conceived, and there may have been a chance my uncle is my brother's father. Uncle passed 2 years before Dad, and we are NC with egg donor for years. Honestly, we don't really care. He's my brother, and our dad is and always be his dad, but weird to think he could be my brother, cousin though. Story 48. Not sure if this counts because it's not technically my family, but they basically raised me when my mother was dealing with her addictions. I lived with a family for a couple of years. They called me their adopted son, and I respected and treated them like parents. They are truly, genuinely nice people who have literally given the shirt off their backs to strangers, but their blind spot is their religion. They are intense Christians. Nothing wrong with that by itself. We prayed twice a day, and they quoted the Bible on the regular. They didn't throw it in people's faces and often helped people who were self-professed Christ haters or whatever. But if you were a devout Christian, they granted you way more social allowance than they should have. I think a lot of people are guilty of this, and not just Christians. Anywho, they raised me with their 2 youngest sons, both around my age, but they had 4 older kids who had since moved out of the house, 3 of which were parents themselves at the time. Everyone and their partners were very welcoming to me. And when I was young, I couldn't have thought of a negative thing to say about them. But their youngest daughter, who was at that time a mother of 3, seemed to be a lot younger than her husband and pretty close to my age. I didn't think too much of it. I was a teenager. Everyone looked young old to me, and she looked like a happy mother of 3 and a proud wife. Even though one of the youngest sons, who was my best friend, didn't like his sister's husband, I brushed it off. Fast forward 10-ish years, when I find out through my best friend that his sister's husband was not only 14 years older than her, but was courting her when she was 14 and he was 27, 28. And the rest of the family, with some exceptions, were okay with them because he's a pastor. Needless to say, when her husband made a post about how homosexual marriage is a blasphemy, and I replied, "What do you think about pedophilia?" he deleted the post. She's since given birth to 6 more kids, and he's moved her away from her family and down to the South. Wonder why. But the last time I spoke with her, she seemed like she was still happy and proud. Story 49. My great-great-grandmother was severely abused by my great-great-grandfather. One day, she overheard him making plans to traffic their 2-year-old daughter to some coworkers. When he came home that night and fell asleep, she sewed him into their bed with a top sheet so he couldn't get out, and beat him to passing with a frying pan. With the help of one of her friends who was a sheriff in Georgia, she crossed the state line and moved to Jacksonville to avoid being prosecuted. A few years later, she moved to Pensacola, and that's how my family ended up here. We've been here since. Story 50. My sister-in-law found out her dad wasn't really her dad through a 23andMe DNA test at 31 years old. She did 23andMe, and so did her biological father, and the results connected them as a father-daughter relationship. The dad that raised her is Native American, and her two brothers have her dad's characteristics, and she looks very white. They thought she just resembled her mom more than her brothers did, and she also thought she was part Native her whole life. She's involved with the culture and produces a lot of Native crafts. This discovery was really upsetting for her, but she met her real dad, and he's a white guy who is a very kind and well-adjusted person that lives in the same city as them. She's enjoying having new half-siblings and nieces and nephews now that she's gotten used to the idea. Story 51. When I realized that my boomer, angry, abusive Catholic mom was angry at the three of us kids our whole childhood because she was a closeted lesbian. She was not able to be herself until my dad died from lung cancer in his 70s. When he passed away and she got a girlfriend, I tried my best to show her how much I supported her without forcing her to come out to me. She died at the age of 80 from Parkinson's without ever admitting it to anyone in the family. I silently forgave her for a lot of my childhood trauma, being absent emotionally and not nurturing at all. It makes me sad that she had to live her whole life that way. Story 52. My uncle used to seem fine, but he's sat funny for the past several years, and I was never sure why. Turns out he was caned in Malaysia as a punishment for an attempted robbery. He negotiated down to not too much jail time, but the number of strokes was high, and it's caused some permanent chronic pain in that region. Story 53. After both my grandparents died, we were cleaning out the house. Us kids, teens at the time, found a picture of my mom in a wedding dress with a guy who was not our dad. She sheepishly admitted that she'd been married before dad. It was brief, only lasted about 6 months. She always said that she wanted to wear a pink wedding dress when she married my dad, but in reality it was pink because my nana wouldn't let her wear white again. Ha 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 ha. 30 years later, and we still tease her about that every so often. Story 54. Multiple. I found out my mom was 40, maybe even younger, but definitely underage, when she met my dad and ran away to get married. She was bipolar. I am too. She originally had twins, but miscarried both. I have an older brother that was taken by the state. My father convinced a church congregation his very much alive wife was dead. My oldest siblings may have eliminated our mother by pushing her down the stairs. Answer. Oh, I myself also did something shocking. I got married and didn't tell anyone. It was to my long-time, on-again and off-again, high school girlfriend. We weren't ready to be married adults. We weren't even in our 20s. We lived separately back with our parents until checks arrived from the bank. We opened a joint checking account were mailed to my home address in my name and my then-wife's name. The box of checks arrived on my mother's birthday. That's how I found out about the myriad of things wrong with my family. But my mother's possible takedown wasn't a revelation until many years later. She died and our oldest siblings decided to hide the incident and have her cremated. It was fudge up. I don't know if it was an insurance scam, a covered-up takedown, a true accident, or what. Story 55. My shock came slow as an adult and realized how fudge up the stuff that I already knew about was. When I was 8, my aunt had a schizophrenic break and eliminate her 4-year-old daughter. It was never hidden from me. I knew as soon as it happened, and I was taught young how she wasn't responsible for the tragedy, and her presence at holidays was never questioned. Found out a month ago my first cousins have never been told, and I was the only child who grew up knowing the whole story. I was almost 30 before I realized just telling me was messed it up. Then at 12, my mom lost custody of me to her mom, my nan, because she would not leave a child predator. That was also never a secret from me. It was also later in life that I comprehended what it meant that my nan kept trying to give me back to my mom, even though she stayed with that man for 7 years. Story 56. My dad told me this as a funny story. I'm the third kid. When my mom found out she was pregnant a third time, she was late 30s and already had 2 C-sections for my siblings. They were using protection, but I apparently broke through said defenses anyway. So my mom immediately calls my grandmother to tell her the news. Now comes the record scratch moment for me. Apparently my mom wasn't sure if she was going to keep me or not. My grandmother actually urged her to go through with an abortion because she already had 2 kids. She was getting older. Another C-section would be hard on her body, etc. Well, she decided to go through the pregnancy. The first time my folks brought me to meet my grandparents, my grandmother was absolutely smitten with me. While everyone is having a good time, my mother decided to poke the bear and bring up how grandmother wanted her to get an abortion. She exploded, was screaming at my mother. She never said that, and why would she make that up? My mom just laughed at her and apologized and switched topics. But yeah, thanks for the great, almost aborted funny story, Dad. Answer: my parents were high school sweethearts and eloped about a year after graduation when my dad joined the military. My mom's parents were horrified by the scandal and told nobody in their circle. A year later, my mom was pregnant with me. It was planned. And my grandmother was even more horrified and told my mom she hoped that she would take care of it and not cause further embarrassment. What was she going to tell her circle when she never got around to telling them her daughter had got married a year earlier? Cut to me being born, and my mom's parents are completely smitten by their first grandchild. Based on how I was treated, you'd never know they wanted my mom to abort her very much planned pregnancy with her husband, and I never held it against them because, honestly, the uptight waspiness and ridiculousness of it all is funny. Story 57, I found out that one of my aunts was violation while she was traveling on a ship. To avoid scandal, my grandparents made an arrangement with the rapist that they will not press charges as long as he marries my aunt. So they got married, and no one said anything after that. It was kept a secret until my aunt died a few years ago. She had a hard life being trapped and chained to a monster who abused her. The biggest blow for me is my grandparents, who failed as parents. They thought that marrying my aunt off to that monster will save her reputation. No wonder she was mentally ill. Answer: unfortunately, this used to be a very common practice in Italy. Maybe elsewhere, but I know Italy for sure. If a woman wasn't a virgin before being married, it would bring shame to the family name, regardless of the reason why. Traditionally, she probably wouldn't ever be able to get married because she wouldn't be worth a dowry. Consequently, that would also mean no kids of her own, so she wouldn't be able to perpetuate her family line, causing her to add another layer of familial shame. The victim marrying their rapist was seen as a good deal to both families involved because it would prevent the cultural shame from ruining her family, and the man agreeing to marry an impure woman was seen as a justifiable punishment, so jail wouldn't be necessary. It's one of the most disgusting and jerk-backwards things I've learned about my homeland. The amount of women that had to endure this isn't even documented because the violation obviously would never have been reported. I'm so sorry to hear your family had similar customs. I guess we can only be grateful that most perspectives have changed and try not to think about how long it took. Story 58. I found out that after my mother's cousin gave birth, way before I was born, over 40 years ago, she repeatedly visited her doctor saying there was something wrong with her baby. They just dismissed her. She ended up walking into the Thames and drowning herself and her baby. The most tragic thing I know about my family. I really hope she would get more help these days. Story 59. I grew up thinking my grandfather snuck aboard a boat during WW2 and came to America. I found out after he died that he spent almost 6 years in a Nazi labor camp just outside of Poland. Not a concentration camp, a labor camp where he basically grew and harvested food for the Nazis. If he never told me when he was born, I doubt he'd want to discuss it, but I've since had a deep interest in the subject. Story 60. I discovered that I have a half-brother. He's a year older than my oldest brother. He was adopted. His bio mom was engaged to my father, but she broke it off and gave the baby up for adoption because she didn't believe in divorce, and she couldn't see herself being married to my father for life. My mom gave me all the information he needed to find his birth family. She said she knew he was out there as my father told her the whole story. Story 61. When I was 14, I accidentally found out I had an older brother. I never met him, but we went to the same schools. He was just 1 year far ahead of me to not be in the same schools at the same time, and I actually met him when I was 30. I only got 20 years with him before he passed away, but his family's always been a big part of my life since then. Answer: I found out about my secret half-sister 2 years ago. My dad had an affair very early on in his marriage and knocked up his mistress. His mistress was also cheating on her husband, so she decided to go back to him, and my dad signed over his parental rights. He died without telling anyone. My sister is only a few days younger than my older brother. She lives less than 10 minutes away from my brother's house in my home state. My dad was a jerk, but my new sister is super cool. Sad I didn't get to know her my whole life. Story 62. I'll go first. Just found out my aunt and uncle are 10 years apart age-wise. Apparently, when my aunt was in her early 30s, she was working at a local night spot while in community college. Just before she graduated, she met my uncle, who was early 20s and struggling financially. She started to make good money and thought he was very handsome, like a young John Travolta. She also wanted to travel, but had no one who could travel with her. So she offered to cover his part of the trips if he would just go with her and keep her company abroad. They traveled everywhere: Japan, Iceland, Australia, and more. They never made anything official until 4 years later. They got married on a cruise in the Netherlands. No invites, no planning, just did it. 2 years later, they had my cousins and settled down in the mountains. All this time, I thought they were the same age and met in college, all to find my aunt was a sugar mama. Story 63. Grandma was an intimacy worker, a phone intimacy operator to be specific. She lived with us growing up to help out with childcare and help my parents financially. She used the dirty, sexy money to pay for dance lessons for my sisters and I. So we'd be out of the house 3 nights a week, and she could watch her programs in peace on the color TV in the living room. She had a real job, too. She was a part-time Spanish translator in the collections department at a major bank. She was a very proper Southern Catholic woman. I didn't find out about the phone intimacy thing until a decade after she passed. Shocked was an understatement. Story 64. My aunt, Mom's half-sister, couldn't find me on 23andMe. Led us down the road to figuring out my grandma had an affair with a traveling salesman in 1951. We contacted his relatives when we found out, and their response was, "Oh no, not another one." Story 65. Uncle, married with an only daughter, got a girl pregnant in high school and has an older adult son he is involved with. Son looks exactly like him. My uncle and his wife, his son, and his son's mother all live in a small Midwestern town, so it's not like the situation is really avoidable in their regular life, but they all just pretend it isn't a thing. Story 66. Triple threat post. I knew growing up that my grandmother had been a postulant, nun in training basically, but left the church to marry my grandfather. They had 2 kids. Sometime later, they got divorced. Catholics don't do the whole divorce thing, so I knew there was something fishy about the story, but who am I to question Grandma? And the other lady she lived with, they were just golfing buddies and roommates, right? Turns out, yeah, she was definitely gay. My grandfather was an unknowing beard sperm donor, and as soon as she got the kids she wanted, she noped out of there. She and her roommate spent 20, 30 years together. After my mom and her sister grew up, they played golf and traveled the U.S. and gave their dog so much love. Here's why this post is a triple threat. I learned about this a few years ago on a trip to visit that side of the family far away from where I live. And 5 minutes prior to this revelation was the revelation that my aunt and uncle really fudge love their state's medical green stuff laws. Wait, so you're telling me the Catholic side of my upbringing came from a bunch of pot-smoking queers? Story 67. My dad has a brother who's estranged. I remember being at his house as a young child. Turns out his wife was pregnant when I was young with twins. She suddenly lost the twins at full term. My grandmother hired a private investigator because the stories weren't lining up. All signs point to my twin cousins being sold on the black market. She confronted my uncle and then cut all contact with him. This was in the early 90s. Story 68. As a teenager, I found out a sibling was my half-sibling. A few years later, I found out I had another sibling. A few years after that, I found out about another sibling. By the 3rd sibling surprise, the shock admittedly started to wear off. Edit. Someone here asked if I'm Meredith Grey. Pretty much the redneck version, yeah. Examples. My school was destroyed by a tornado. Had to go to school in a Walmart for a bit. Had an uncle get arrested for 30 counts of take a guess, and I got publicly shunned in dramatic fashion from the family at a wedding rehearsal for saying, "Hey, maybe let's not bring him to a wedding with kids." Mom was a mortician and broke her back pulling a body out of a canal. Dad fell out of the tree he was cutting when he cut the branch he was sitting on. Broke both legs, almost taken out by the chainsaw. I found him in a fire ant bed too. Sister had a clothing iron fall on her face. Other sister drowned in the family pool and was resuscitated after being saved by the 8-year-old brother. And I almost lost my finger to a 1930s air compressor. Gestures broadly at Katrina. One sister was at a sleepover at what I later learned may or may not have been a KKK-friendly house when her and her group of friends got shot at while sleeping in a tent. He got shot by the homeowner. And yeah, I've been working on a book for years, but biographies are generally only successful if you care about the author. I'm just a meanie with a backstory. Double edit. My God, the attention to this may get me off my jerk to work on it again. Shoot. The working title was Award-Winning Butthole, but meanie with a backstory works too. Answer. Something similar happened to my mom. She never knew her dad. Her mother had an affair with a married man back in the 60s. After wondering about him her whole life, one day about 5 years ago, she decided, fudge it, I'm gonna blow up some lives. She did a 23andMe, went on to Ancestry.com, and within about 2 hours, she was drafting an email to her newly discovered half-sister. It turned out her dad had been dead for years, but the family was really cool with my mom about the whole thing. Apparently, Grandpa was a bit of a rake to date. They have discovered 8 kids from extramarital affairs. Every time a new one pops up, they welcome them to the family and clink their glasses to horny old dad. Story 69. I have a couple of shocking things. Can't decide which is more weird. My great-grandpa eliminated a man over fried chicken. Someone handed plates out at a casual backyard. get together. And my grandpa apparently didn't like that. The man stepped in front of him. This was late 30s. My dad and mom were not married at the time of my story 70. When my grandma was in the hospital on her passing bed, they came in and took out a bridge from her upper teeth. No one in the family knew it existed. For 60 years, she had had this bridge and no one knew about it. She had met my grandfather when she was 19 and had my dad a year later. My grandfather was a biker, and all this was going down in the 50s. She told us that she had attended a party with him at his clubhouse and they got super tipsy. Apparently, she got up on a table and started talking shoot to him. He did not like that the rest of the bikers started making fun of him over it. He walked over and punched her square in the mouth, knocking out all of her teeth. They broke up after this, and my dad was raised by someone else. She never told him or anyone this ever happened. We only found out because of a morphine confessional. Story 71. 10 years ago, I reunited with my older sister in my dad's side of the family. Turns out myself and my younger siblings are the result of being a hidden family. We had no idea. I knew my dad was married previously, and I had a sister, but I did not know my mother, and I were secrets for 2 years while he was still married. Wild. Story 72. Knew my dad had a weird childhood. He was the second in a set of Irish twins to a teen mom with a teen mom in the 60s. Definitely not good. But it never occurred to Nay how odd it was that his older brother stayed with his mom and he went with his dad, who was not interested in being a father. Turns out, my dad was a chronic bedwetter, so his mom just dumped him at his dad's house. It was especially hard to hear because my brother was a chronic bedwetter, and instead of getting him help, they just made him use diapers until middle school. Story 73. I found out when I was 26 that I had an older brother who was put up for adoption. My mom had him when she was a teenager in the 1970s and put him up for no-contact adoption, and he went to an unknown family. The only living people in my family who knew about it were my mother, her sister, and my dad, whom she married years later. I stumbled upon it while on Ancestry.com looking for my grandfather's Korean War records. I didn't know my brother's name, but my mother has a very distinct name, and the website listed her name, age, and birth location as his possible mother. So after seeing this, I called her up, and she confirmed his existence. We've met up a few times, and it is pretty cool to see some of the similarities we have. Answer, that's so cool you could meet. My aunt had a baby when she was a teenager in the 60s that she placed for adoption. I did an ancestry test, and it connected us as cousins. I have sent her 3 different messages years ago, but she never responded, which is sad because she could have had the opportunity to meet her birth mom and half-sister, but they're dead now. Story 74. When my aunt died unexpectedly of a stroke, my uncle discovered that she had a storage unit that he didn't know about. In that storage unit was a 55-gallon drum containing the body of her abusive ex. She was a mild-mannered, sweet suburban mom. Absolutely no one saw that coming.